They say a man who drinks as much as I did back then is running from something. I never disagreed with that. I just never told anyone what I was running from, because anyone I told would have filed a psychiatric hold, and I would have spent the rest of my career reviewing cargo manifests on level 14. So I kept my mouth shut and my flask full, and I did my job, which was to find people who didn't want to be found and drag them back into the light where the collective's cameras could see them clearly. My name is Kong. I was an inspector with the Tung Tech Enforcement Division, Station Ring 7, Orbital Slot 44 North. That was my world. 40,000 humans crammed into a pressurized aluminum donut hanging 300 kilometers above a planet none of us had been born on and most of us would never visit. We were logistics people, cargo handlers, system technicians, shift supervisors, and enforcers like me. The collective needed us to keep the throughput moving. That was the sum of our purpose. Keep the throughput moving and don't ask too many questions about what was in the cargo. I had been doing that for 11 years when I saw her the first time. It was a routine call, a disturbance in the executive residential block, level 6. The kind of disturbance that gets logged as a maintenance issue by the shift coordinator and flagged for enforcement only because one of the senior vice presidents pressed his emergency contact twice, and the system registered genuine biometric distress. I took the call because I was on rotation, and because I had nowhere else to be. The lift opened on level 6 and I heard it before I saw anything. Not screaming, not alarms. Something quieter and more wrong than either of those things. A sound like structural settling, like the station's hull flexing under thermal variance, except it was coming from inside a room and it was rhythmic and deliberate. I drew my sidearm and moved down the corridor. The door to the vice president's suite was standing open, not forced, not blown. Open, the way a door opens when someone knows the code and doesn't particularly care who sees them using it. I came through low and fast with my sidearm up and I stopped. The vice president was on the floor. He was still breathing. I checked that first because it was the first thing I always checked, and in 11 years on Ring 7, it had never before mattered whether I bothered. That night it mattered because the vice president was the only thing in that room I understood. She was standing at the window wall. The curve of the station's outer skin gave a view of open space and the hard white disk of the orbital sun reflector, and she was standing in front of that view like she had always been there, and I was the intruder. She was dressed in a bodysuit that caught no light, and she was holding something about the size of my fist in her right hand, and she was looking at me. She had silver eyes. Not contacts, not augmentation rings. Silver, reflective, opaque, the way a sensor array is silver, the way nothing biological should be silver. She said something to me in a language I didn't recognize, low and flat like a system diagnostic running aloud, and then she stepped backward through the exterior window. The exterior window, 300 kilometers above the planet. I ran to it and there was nothing there. No breach, no decompression alarm. The window was intact. She was gone. The vice president on the floor behind me was beginning to make sounds that were almost words, and I stood at an unbroken window looking at empty space, and I understood, right then, in my bones, that whatever had just happened to me was not going to fit into a standard incident report. I wrote it up as a robbery with assault. Unknown perpetrator, fled before enforcement arrived. I kept the silver eyes to myself. That was the beginning. The second time I saw her was 14 months later, and by then the world had changed considerably, although most of us on Ring 7 hadn't noticed yet. The collective noticed. The collective always noticed things before the rest of us, which was how they had managed to become the collective in the first place. Tung Tech had started as a logistics company 30-some years before I was born, and through a sequence of mergers and acquisitions and regulatory arrangements that I was not qualified to examine, it had become the single operating entity that ran approximately 70% of all orbital commerce between this system's inhabited bodies. They owned the stations, They owned the ships. They employed the enforcers and the technicians and the cargo handlers. They did not, as far as any of us knew, own the diamond of Emperor Chen. Nobody owned the diamond of Emperor Chen. That was rather the point. I want to be careful here about what I say and don't say, because even now, even after everything that came after, there are aspects of what that object was and what it represented that I don't fully understand and am not certain I'm qualified to explain. What I can tell you is what the collective's internal briefing material said, which I read without authorization through a terminal I had no clearance to access, in a corridor I had no business being in, at 3 in the morning station time, while most of the senior staff were asleep. The diamond was old, older than the collective, older than orbital commerce. The briefing materials referenced something called the Emperor Chen Archive, which was a pre-collective data repository so ancient that portions of it were stored on physical media that the current systems couldn't read without specialized translation hardware. The archive described, in terms that the briefing analyst had clearly found uncomfortable, a set of navigational coordinates, not coordinates to a place in this system. Coordinates to a convergence point, a location in deep space that the archive's authors had apparently considered so significant that they encoded access to it inside a physical object. A gemstone, lattice-structured, light refractive, and according to a footnote in the briefing that someone had tried and failed to redact, partially composed of materials that did not appear on any known table of elements. The collective wanted that coordinates. So did everyone else who knew the coordinates existed. So did the entities who had apparently been trying, quietly and for some time, to ensure that no human ever read them. I didn't know any of that on the night Co-Kit broke into the Tung Tech vault on level 2. What I knew was that my dispatch system logged a silent alarm from the vault level at 2:17, and when I pulled the camera feed it was already dark, and when I sent a security unit down to investigate they found the door to the primary secure storage chamber standing open in exactly the same way as that vice president's suite door 14 months earlier. Open, not forced, not blown, as if someone had known the code. I went down myself. The vault was empty of people and the storage chamber had been accessed, and the object that the collective logged in their system simply as Asset 1 was missing. In its place, on the center of the display cradle, was a small device I recognized as a short-range communications jammer, already burned out, its function completed, sitting there like a calling card. I was standing there looking at the burned jammer when she spoke behind me. Not the silver-eyed woman, someone else, someone who smelled like recycled air and machine oil and moved like she had grown up in maintenance shafts, which I later learned was essentially true. She was young enough that I was immediately irritated, because young people on Ring 7 were either terrified or overconfident, and this one was neither. She was just standing there in the doorway with her hands visible and a smile that was doing too much work. She said, "I didn't take it." I said, "Get on the floor." She said, "I really didn't take it, Inspector. I was here to take it, but someone took it first, and I think we both know who, and I think you need me a lot more than I need you right now." Her name was Co-Kit. She went by Octopus, which she explained was a reference to her ability to be in multiple places in a system simultaneously. Through a network of remote access tools, she had built herself over 8 years of working the station's gray market technical underground. She was a thief and a hacker, and she was, I admitted to myself later, and only to myself, probably the most naturally talented systems infiltrator I had encountered in 11 years of chasing such people. She had penetrated the vault's security architecture by rerouting its authentication queries through a maintenance node 3 levels up, substituting cached credentials that were technically valid but 17 minutes stale. The vault system hadn't caught it because it was programmed to flag fresh credentials, not old ones. Nobody had thought to program it for old ones because nobody had thought to try old ones. She had thought to try old ones. The distinction seems minor until you understand that the collective security team had dozens of people and a significant budget and multiple years to think about vault security, and they had not arrived at this particular vector. Kit had arrived at it because she had a mind that naturally found the gap between what a system was designed to prevent and what a system had actually been implemented to prevent. And she exploited that gap not with force, but with patience and a willingness to try the thing that seemed too simple to be worth trying. 8 years. She had been doing this since she was 15. I thought about that for a moment in the alcove, and then I thought about something else because thinking about it too long was not useful. The problem was that someone had beaten her there by approximately 23 minutes, and that someone had not bothered with any of this. That someone had simply walked through the security door, and the security door had opened for her, and the camera system had not captured a single frame. I knew who that was. I had known the moment I saw the empty cradle. The woman with silver eyes. Kit knew her too, or knew of her. She called her the Gale Feng, and said the name the way you say a thing you've heard talked about in whispers and are not entirely comfortable saying aloud. She told me that the Gale was not collective enforcement and not any agency she recognized. She told me that the Gale had been operating on Ring 7 for approximately 3 months, and that in that time she had killed 4 people, all of them senior executives of Tung Tech or its subsidiary operations, and that nobody had been able to get a solid identification on her because the camera systems consistently failed in her presence. I told Kit she could walk out of the vault if she came with me, which she agreed to with the ease of someone who had already calculated that this was the best available option. I didn't formally arrest her. I told the dispatch system I had cleared the scene. I took her to a maintenance alcove on level 8 that I used sometimes when I needed to think without anyone watching, and I sat down on a pipe housing and pulled out my flask and I thought. Kit sat across from me and watched me think. She did not ask about the flask. She had enough judgment for that. The Gale had taken the diamond. The Gale, as best I could determine, was not human, or not entirely human, and operated through means I couldn't explain and the camera systems couldn't capture. She had the diamond now, and she had gone somewhere, through a window, or through a wall, or through whatever physics she operated under, and the collective was going to discover in approximately 4 hours that Asset 1 was gone, and they were going to begin a search. And that search was going to involve everyone on Ring 7 being interviewed and audited and scanned. And somewhere in that process, a sharp-eyed analyst was going to pull the incident report from 14 months ago and see my name on it and start asking questions. I had about 4 hours to find the Gale and get the diamond back. Kit said, "I can find her." I said, "How?" She said, "She came through the station systems to get into the vault. I don't care what she looks like or what she does to cameras. She had to interface with the authentication architecture somehow, and authentication leaves traces. I built a tracer specifically for this. I've been building it for 3 months." I looked at her. She looked back. I said, "You've been tracking her for 3 months." She said, "My employer sent me to steal the diamond. My employer has been trying to steal it for 2 years. He asked me to find out why previous attempts kept getting intercepted before they reached the object. I found the Gale. Then I built a tracer. Then tonight I went to use it and discovered she'd already moved." I said, "Who's your employer?" She said, "He's going to be angry with me." I said, "That's not an answer." She said, "His name is Lung. He's the kind of person you already know about if you work Ring 7 enforcement." I knew about Lung. Everyone in enforcement knew about Lung Yu. He was what passed for organized crime in a station environment, not the romantic criminal of old flat-screen drama, not a man in an expensive suit with a civilized veneer, but a sprawling network of debt and leverage that had its fingers in cargo diversions and contraband and identity fraud, and probably a dozen other things I hadn't managed to document. He was dangerous not because he was physically violent, although he was, but because he was patient. He had been building his network on Ring 7 for 9 years, and he had not made a significant mistake in 9 years. He was not going to be pleased that Ko-Kit had failed. She told me what the diamond was supposed to unlock, and I sat there in my maintenance alcove on level 8 and drank from my flask and listened. And the more she talked, the more certain I became that the camera problem and the silver eyes and the woman who stepped through intact windows 300 kilometers above a planet were not the strangest part of what was happening on Ring 7. They had always been here. That was the strangest part. Not the Gale specifically, but the thing the Gale represented. Ko-Kit used a word I didn't have a translation for. She said it in a language she'd pulled from the Emperor Chen archive files, a language that predated any human tongue she knew of, and she said it meant approximately something like those who calculate ahead. She said the archive, in its oldest layers, in the sections that the collective's translation hardware had the most difficulty rendering, described them in terms that were clearly not metaphorical, not mythology, not allegory. A species that had been present in this system before the first human colony ship arrived, that had been present in a state of watchful assessment for the entirety of human development in this region, and that had very specific reasons for wanting the coordinates that the diamond encoded. The coordinates did not lead to treasure, not in any sense Ko-Kit or I understood as treasure. They led to a point of deep space convergence where, according to the archive, the species she was describing had established something that translated roughly as a ceiling point, a location at which a decision had been made and formalized, a locked conclusion about a species they had been studying for a very long time. Ko-Kit said, "The archive doesn't say what the conclusion was, the section that would tell us that is encoded inside the diamond itself." I said, "What are they?" She pulled a small device from her kit and showed me a recording. It was low resolution, pulled from a black market camera she had installed in a maintenance junction on level 3 2 months prior. The timestamp read 3:40. The corridor was empty. Then it wasn't. A figure appeared in the frame the way a light turns on, not entering from one end, simply present, between one frame and the next. The figure moved down the corridor. It moved correctly, the way a person moves, but with a precision that felt calculated. Each step placed with the exactness of a machine running a gate algorithm rather than a body moving on instinct. It reached a closed maintenance hatch. It did not open the hatch. It stood before the hatch, and the hatch's locking indicator went from red to green, and the hatch opened, and the figure walked through, and the hatch closed. I said, "The Veth." Ko-Kit looked at me. I said, "That's what the senior staff calls them. It's in a file I wasn't supposed to read." She said, "How long has the collective known?" I said, "Long enough to have a name for them." The Veth were what you got when you tried to describe a species using only the evidence of what they left behind. The collective had not made contact. They had made a file. They had assigned the name based on a word fragment from the Emperor Chen archive, a word that the translators rendered as storm center, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, the eye of the storm, the place where everything is still and everything revolves around that stillness. The collective had decided that nomming them was safer than acknowledging them. I understood that logic. I had used the same logic myself. They were biological, or they had been once. What they were now was something that had moved past the boundary where biological and synthetic become the same question. They did not experience pain the way we understood pain. They processed sensory input from damage the way a system processes an error report, registering it, routing it, compensating, continuing. Their probability mapping was the part that kept me awake later. On the nights when I allowed myself to think about it, they did not react to situations. They modeled situations, running outcome calculations faster than human cognition could track, and then they moved through the model they had already constructed. They did not, in a meaningful sense, encounter surprises. I want to explain what that means practically because I have thought about it a great deal and I think precision matters here. When a human faces a threat, we process the threat and formulate a response, and there is a gap, small but real, between the stimulus and the action. In that gap lives hesitation and fear, and the residue of every previous decision we've ever made about whether to fight or hold or run. The Veth did not have that gap. Their response was already in progress before the stimulus completed, because they had already modeled the stimulus 3 steps back in the sequence. They were always living slightly ahead of the moment, in the model they had constructed of how the moment would unfold. Against a predictable opponent, that is essentially unbeatable. The key was the word predictable. The model has to be built on something. It has to be built on observed behavior, extrapolated and extended and probability weighted. And if the observed behavior is consistent, if the species being modeled behaves according to rational self-interest, or according to biological drives that map cleanly onto prediction algorithms, or according to any system of logic that can be reduced to rules, then the model is good and you cannot surprise them. You can only fall into the outcome they have already calculated. But humans are not consistent. That is our oldest complaint about ourselves, written in every discipline we have ever developed: ethics, law, governance, psychology, 11,000 years of philosophy that is essentially one long argument about why we don't do what we know we should. We contradict ourselves. We act against our own interests. We make decisions under emotional load that no rational model would predict. We make decisions based on half-remembered things our fathers said, based on stubbornness, based on spite, based on love, based on the particular quality of light through a window on a specific morning that reminded us of something we can't name. We are, as a species, profoundly difficult to model accurately at the individual level, and at the group level, when individuals are interacting with each other under stress, when you have a drunk enforcement inspector and a 23-year-old thief who works for a man with a specific philosophy about loss, all in the same storage bay on level 11. At that level, we become something very close to noise. The Veth had been studying us long enough that they had built a very good model. Their very good model did not fully account for lung U. We had 3 hours and 40 minutes before the vault discovery. Co-Kit activated her tracer, which she ran through the maintenance terminal in the alcove because I gave her the access code, and the tracer did what she had built it to do. It found the authentication trace the Gale had left in the vault system, and it followed it backward through 3 relay nodes and a recycled subnet addressed to a physical location. Level 11. The Gale was in a storage bay on level 11 that was registered to a shell entity that resolved, after Co-Kit ran it through 4 layers of corporate registry data, to a subsidiary of a subsidiary that ultimately pointed back to Tung Tech itself. The collective had a room. While Co-Kit ran the trace, I stood in the alcove and thought about what I was about to do. This is the part I've gone back to in memory more times than any other part of that night. Not the confrontation, not the diamond, not the Gale's silver eyes. Just those minutes in the maintenance alcove on level 8 while Co-Kit's fingers moved across her device and the station hummed around us with its 40,000 sleeping and working inhabitants. I was an enforcement inspector. I had a sidearm and a flask and a moderate reputation for reliability in the narrow operational context for which I had been trained. I was about to go to level 11 and confront something that walked through walls. I was about to do it with a 23-year-old thief for backup, a thief who worked for Lung Yu, a thief who had just told me that everything I thought I understood about the security of this station was built on top of a penetration that ran all the way to the corporate structure. I was about to do it because there was no one else, because the alternative was to file a report and wait for Superior to make a decision, and watch 3 hours and 40 minutes become 2 hours and 30, and then 1 hour and the vault discovery would happen, and the collective's institutional response would kick in. And then whatever Co-Kit and I had managed to learn tonight would get buried under 4 layers of corporate information management, until it was safe and sanitized and useless. I was about to go do something very stupid because it was the only thing available, and because I had spent 11 years on Ring 7, and I had a certain proprietary feeling about the people on this station, the 40,000 people who were moving cargo and breathing recycled air and complaining about the food processing and making whatever small futures they were making, who had no idea that an alien species had been living in the walls and running an assessment, and had arrived at a conclusion they didn't like. That proprietary feeling is what enforcement work does to you if you stay at it long enough. It becomes yours. The station becomes yours, not officially, not legally, but in the way that anything you've watched over and argued with and dragged back into the light for 11 years eventually becomes yours. Ko-Kit looked up from her device and said, "Got her." Ko-Kit said very quietly, "They've been inside the company." I said, "For how long?" She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. We both understood that the length of time didn't matter as much as the implication. The collective thought they had been studying the Veth. The Veth had been inside the collective for long enough to register a storage bay in a subsidiary shell, and nobody had questioned it. I radioed nothing. I filed no report. I told dispatch I was following a lead on the vault breach and went dark, which was unusual but not unprecedented for me. I had a history of going dark for stretches during investigations, which was usually explained by my known relationship with a flask, and which I had never bothered to correct. I took Ko-Kit with me. I signed out a weapons case from the equipment locker on level 9, and I stood there for a moment looking at what was in the case and thinking about what I was going to do with it. I was going to go to level 11 and confront a member of a species that walked through windows and could not be captured on camera. I took the weapons case. I also took a second flask from my desk drawer, the one I kept for situations that were worse than the standard kind. The lift to level 11 was a freight lift, slow and deliberate, and we rode it without talking. I used the time to check my sidearm and put it back and check it again, which was a habit and not a strategy because I already knew what the sidearm was and wasn't going to accomplish. Ko-Kit used the time to run what I later understood were parallel intrusion routines through her device, testing the shell subsidiary system from a distance, probing for active defenses, mapping the network architecture before we physically arrived. She was doing this with the calm focus of someone running a routine diagnostic, not someone riding a freight lift towards something that had already walked through 2 separate security systems without leaving a trace. I said, "Have you ever been in a situation like this before?" She said, "Depends on how you define like this." I said, "This specific kind of situation." She said, "No." Then, after a pause, "I've been in situations where I was reasonably sure I was going to get caught. This is the first one where I wasn't sure catching was the relevant concern." The lift opened on level 11. Level 11 was cargo storage, the deep archive section where containers were stacked in the low-grav environment and left for months at a time between transfer windows. It smelled of polymer sealant and the particular dry cold of recycled atmosphere that hasn't been breathed for a while. The lights were on emergency low, and our shadows preceded us down the access corridor. The corridor ran for perhaps 200 meters before it branched. We were moving through a section of the station that most people on Ring 7 had never visited, and most of the staff had no reason to think about. That was the nature of archive storage. It existed in the gaps of the operational map, necessary but peripheral, accessible but rarely accessed. It was exactly the kind of space you would choose if you needed a room that wouldn't be noticed. Ko-Kit moved quietly, not the performed quiet of someone trying to be stealthy, but the natural quiet of someone who had spent years in maintenance shafts and access corridors, and had simply internalized the practice of moving without announcement. I moved less quietly. I was aware of my own footsteps against the deck plating and the slight wheeze of the climate system, and the particular frequency of the emergency lighting, which was a tone that always felt faintly wrong to human eyes, the color of something right at the edge of what we're wired to process comfortably. She had been here. I could feel it in the way the air sat wrong. That's not a scientific statement. That's the statement of a man who spent 11 years in enforcement and developed a sensitivity to spaces where something consequential had occurred, a sensitivity I had always assumed was pattern recognition, and which I was now less certain about. Kit stopped and pointed at a bay door to the left that looked identical to every other bay door on the level. She said the signal was inside. I went in first. The storage bay was configured differently from the others. The container stacks had been arranged to create a central open space, and in that space there was equipment I didn't have a name for, not collective equipment, not any human manufacture I recognized. It was low and flat and seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it, and it was operational. I could see the faint indication of active processes in the way the air around it bent slightly, the way heat bends air, except it wasn't heat. The gale was standing in front of it. She turned when I entered, the same silver eyes, opaque and still. She was holding the diamond in her right hand, and she looked at me with an expression I could not read because it was not an expression that human faces make. It was the expression of a calculation completing. She said something in that flat diagnostic language, and then, as if reaching for a less efficient but more accessible protocol, she said in clear station standard, "You should not be here, Inspector." I said, "Give me the diamond." She turned the diamond in her fingers once, the way you turn something when you are examining it and already know what it is. She said, "The sealing point will be accessed. The assessment has concluded. This is not a thing that your objection changes." I said, "What assessment?" She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "Yours." I should have felt something large at that, I suppose. Later I would think about that moment and recognize what it was, a species telling me, clearly and without particular malice, that the verdict was in, and there was nothing to discuss. But in that moment what I felt was the particular narrow focus that comes after 11 years of enforcement work and enough alcohol to kill a smaller person. I felt the specific clarity of a man who has one available action and is simply going to take it. I fired, standard collective sidearm, 2 shots. The range was 8 meters. She didn't move, or she moved through the shots. I saw the moment, the fractional recognition of trajectory, the body already translating sideways in a movement that started before I pulled the trigger. Not fast. Faster than fast is the wrong way to put it. She moved as if the shots were something she had already modeled, something she had built into her position a step before I fired, and the adjustment was minimal and sufficient. She crossed the space between us in 3 steps and took my sidearm and held it, and looked at it with what I can only describe as mild curiosity, and then she set it on the floor. She said, "You are not the threat category your species was assessed as." I said, "Then give me the diamond." She said, "No." Kit behind me said, "I found your subnet." The Gale looked at Kit. Something in her face shifted. Not much. Not in the way faces shift with emotion. In the way a model shifts when a new variable appears that wasn't in the original parameters. Kit held up her device. She said, "Your local system, the one running on that equipment behind you, I've been in it for the last 40 seconds. I want you to know that before I tell you the next part." The Gale said nothing. Kit said, "The next part is that I copied your assessment files. The whole assessment. Everything your species has recorded about humans in this system, going back far enough that the timestamp format took me 3 minutes to decode. And I've queued it for broadcast on the station's open communications array. The moment I release this dead man switch, it goes out on every channel the station runs, and then it propagates through every relay node in range. And inside an hour every human settlement in this orbital zone, gets a data packet telling them exactly what your species has been doing here and exactly what your conclusion was. The gale was very still. I understood what Co-Kit was doing. She was being irrational. She was threatening a species that could model threat responses with a threat that a rational actor would not make, because a rational actor in this position would recognize that the Veth could simply disable her in the same way they disabled my sidearm. The threat was not coherent from a strategic standpoint. The threat was the kind of thing you say when you are a 20-something thief who has just read something that frightened her, and who responds to being frightened by reaching for defiance the way some people reach for a flask. The Gale said, broadcasting the assessment would create mass societal disruption. Co-Kit said, yes. The Gale said, that outcome is outside the optimal parameters. Co-Kit said, yes. The Gale said, you would not do this. Co-Kit said, my employer is Lung Yu. There was a silence that lasted approximately 3 seconds, which does not sound long until you are standing in a cold storage bay on level 11, watching a near-inhuman intelligence recalculate. I had met Lung Yu twice, both times briefly, both times in the context of enforcement inquiries that he had navigated with the particular calm of someone who is entirely confident that the inquiry will not reach him. He was a large man, not in the way of people who cultivate physical presence, but in the way of people who have simply always occupied more space than average. He had a face that expressed nothing except attention and a voice that was very quiet, which I have learned is more dangerous than loudness in most operational contexts. What I knew about Lung Yu, in addition to his crimes, was that he had a specific philosophy about loss. He had explained it to me, actually in the second of our 2 brief meetings, unprompted, as if he genuinely thought it was useful information for me to have. He said, a loss that embarrasses me is a loss I repay regardless of cost. He said it the way a person states a preference, matter of fact, without drama. Co-Kit was telling the Gale, you have already embarrassed Lung Yu by taking the diamond before his operative could. He is the kind of entity who will cause disruption in response to that embarrassment regardless of the optimal parameters. He will make noise. He will burn things down, not because it's strategic, but because that is what he does, and I know that, and I am his operative, and I have been in your system for 40 seconds. The Geth model, I understood in that moment, accounted for rational responses. It accounted for threat calculations. It accounted for species that ultimately weighed consequences and chose survivable options. It did not fully account for Lung Yu. It had clearly not fully accounted for Co-Kit. And it was standing in a storage bay looking at me, and I saw the moment. The unmistakable human-readable moment, the one that crosses species lines, when something that had been certain became uncertain. I said, give us the diamond. The Gale looked at me. The silver eyes tracked precise and still. She said, the assessment is not wrong. I said, maybe not, but it's incomplete. She considered that. I do not know what it looks like inside a Veth intelligence when it considers something, but I know what the outside looks like. It looks like a person standing very still, and then it looks like a person who has made a decision. She held out the diamond. I took it. It was lighter than I expected. Cold, the way things are cold in recycled atmosphere, and the surface caught the emergency low light of the storage bay in a way that was not quite right, scattering wavelengths that a simple gemstone should not scatter. I held it for a moment, and then I handed it to Co-Kit. Because Co-Kit was the one who had a plan for it, and I was, in the final analysis, an enforcement inspector with an empty sidearm and a flask, and I was beginning to understand the limits of that. Co-Kit released the dead man's switch. She lowered the device. She said to the Gale, the assessment is still in your system. The Gale said, yes. Co-Kit said, I didn't delete it. The Gale said, I know. Co-Kit said, so you know I can still broadcast it. The Gale said, yes. Co-Kit said, Then we have an agreement. There was that silence again. Then the Gale said, "What agreement?" Kit said, "You tell your people that the assessment is incomplete. You tell them it needs more data. You tell them the ceiling point decision should be suspended pending a full review of the dataset." She tilted the device in her hand. "And in exchange, I don't broadcast what I already have, which would definitely give your people a lot of data to work with, just not the kind you want." I looked at Kit. I had been an enforcement inspector for 11 years. I had interviewed a great many people in a great many uncomfortable situations. I had very rarely encountered anyone who could stand in a cold storage bay on level 11 and negotiate with a member of a species that walked through walls, while holding a dead man's switch that she had armed 40 seconds after entering the room, while remaining completely composed. She was 23 years old. She was a thief. She was the most capable person I had encountered in 11 years of enforcement work, and I was standing there watching her restructure the terms of an alien assessment. The Gale said, "A review would take time." Kit said, "Good." The Gale said, "The review would require access, continued observation." Kit said, "That's fine. You've been observing us for a long time already. Just do it with the understanding that we know you're doing it and we're watching back." She paused. "That's what changes. That's the new data point." Another silence. Then the Gale said something in her diagnostic language, low and precise. Then she stepped backward, the way she had stepped backward through the vice president's window 14 months ago, except this time I was close enough to see what actually happened. She didn't step through the wall. She stepped into a fold in the space that the equipment behind her was generating, and the fold closed after her, and she was gone, and the equipment went dark, and Kit and I were alone in the storage bay with the diamond of Emperor Chen, and approximately 90 minutes before the vault breach would be discovered. Kit said, "We need to talk about what I'm going to tell Lung." I said, "Yes." She said, "And what you're going to put in your report." I said, "I know." She said, "And what we're going to do with this." She held up the diamond. I looked at it. In the now complete darkness of the storage bay, with the Veth equipment inert, the diamond gave off its own faint light. Not much. Not the dramatic luminescence of fiction. Just a quiet, steady, pale illumination, the color of the orbital sun reflector seen through 300 kilometers of vacuum. Old light. Patient light. I said, "What does it actually say, inside it, the encoded message?" Kit was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know. I was in their system for 40 seconds. The assessment files were the first thing I found. I didn't have time to read the diamond's encoding." I said, "But you read enough of the assessment to know what it said about us." She said, "Yes." I said, "What did it say?" She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said, "It said we were dangerous." I said, "That sounds right." She said, "Not dangerous the way they expected. Not dangerous because we're violent or because we build effective weapons or because we're particularly intelligent. Dangerous because—" She stopped. She turned the diamond in her fingers, the same gesture the Gale had used, unconscious. Dangerous because the model doesn't hold. Because every time they think they understand what we're going to do, we do something else. Not strategically. Not deliberately. Just because we're like that. Because we contain people like Lung and people like you, and people like me, all at once in the same population, and the spread of behavior is too wide to predict reliably. I said, "And the conclusion, the ceiling." She said, "The assessment recommended removing our access to the deep space routes, locking us into this system, not destroying us, they weren't recommending that, just containing us, keeping us in a limited operational space while they continued to study whether the variance in behavior would stabilize over time." She looked at the diamond. The ceiling point was where they were going to formalize that, lock it in. A conclusion with no appeal, encoded at a location only they could access and only they could change. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about 40,000 people on Ring 7 and all the other stations, and all the colony ships, and all the long-range survey missions, and the exploratory vectors that were already filed and waiting for funding, the human expansion that was quietly and stubbornly, and not particularly elegantly pressing outward in every available direction. I thought about Lung Yu, who was going to be angry, and Ko Kit, who had armed a dead man's switch in 40 seconds, and the vice president on level 6 whose window had been walked through without breaking. I thought about myself with a flask and a sidearm and 11 years of enforcement work that had not, until tonight, touched anything larger than cargo diversion. I said we should go. We went. The report I filed said, Vault breach, perpetrator identified as Ko Kit, civilian contractor for an undisclosed employer, currently cooperating with enforcement in an ongoing investigation. Asset 1 recovered and secured. The diamond went back into the vault. The collective did their audit and found nothing missing. The Shell subsidiary on level 11 was flagged for review by a different department, and when that department sent someone to examine the storage bay, they found empty space and polymer sealant smell, and no equipment, and no evidence of any active operations. Lung Yu called Ko Kit 4 hours after the vault was secured. She took the call in my maintenance alcove on level 8. I sat on my pipe housing and listened to one side of it. She said, I have it. Long pause. She said, I recovered it from a competing interest. Longer pause. She said, the competing interest has agreed to stand down. The diamond remains in the vault. Continued access to the vault is now a negotiation, not an operation. Another pause. You have leverage you didn't have before. That's worth something. The longest pause. Then she ended the call and sat down on the floor of the maintenance alcove and put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. I said, is he satisfied? She said, he's Lung. He's never satisfied, but he's not coming for me, which is what matters tonight. I said, what about the Veth? She said, the Gale will go back and make the argument for a continued observation period. Whether they listen to her is a different question. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. The assessment files are still in my system. I'm keeping them. If anyone from their side pushes the ceiling decision forward, I broadcast. They know that. We know that. It's not a solution. It's a standoff. I said, that's not very satisfying. She said, no, but it's what we've got, and humans are very good at standoffs. I thought about that. Then I thought about the diamond in its vault 2 levels below us, with its encoded coordinates that pointed to a decision we had delayed and not erased. I thought about the Gale stepping into a fold in space. I thought about the long years of a patient species watching us from inside our own administrative systems, building a model, reaching a conclusion that said, contain them. I thought about Ko Kit at 23 years old, with a dead man's switch armed in 40 seconds. I said, get some sleep. She said, what are you going to do? I looked at my flask. I had used maybe a third of it tonight, which was considerably less than a normal night and considerably more than nothing. I put it back in my jacket. I said, I'm going to file the rest of my report, and then I'm going to review the Emperor Chen archive access logs and find out how many other Veth installations we have on Ring 7. And then I'm going to think very carefully about who else needs to know what I know, and how much of it they need to know, and how to tell them in a way that doesn't cause a mass societal disruption. Ko Kit looked at me. I said, and then I'm going to get some coffee. She almost smiled. It was the first almost smile I'd seen from her that wasn't the working kind, the one she used when she was calculating something. This one was just tired and young and present. She said, you're going to be different after this. I said, I was different the moment I saw her through the window on level 6. I just didn't admit it yet. I left her there and walked back to the enforcement office and sat down at my terminal and started to write. What I wrote was careful and partial and true, as much of it as I dared put in a system that the Veth had demonstrated they could access at will. I wrote about the vault breach and the recovery. I wrote about a person of interest named Kit. I wrote that Asset 1 had been recovered and should be considered a priority security concern, and that the origin of the breach required further investigation. I flagged the file for the attention of the senior analyst I considered least likely to be a Veth penetration, which was a judgment call I made based on 11 years of watching people and could easily have been wrong. It took me 40 minutes to write the official report. In 11 years, I had never taken 40 minutes on a report. I was not being thorough. I was being careful in a new way, careful the way you're careful when you know that the words you choose are being read by someone who is not human, and who will use your language against you if you give it room to. Every sentence I wrote in that official report, I weighed for what it implied and what it denied, and what it left deliberately open. It was the most exhausting writing I had ever done. It was also, I think, the most honest report I had ever filed, because the constraints of writing for an unknown hostile reader forced me to be precise in a way that standard enforcement reporting had never required. Then I opened a separate document that was not connected to the collective system, a local-only document written to a physical storage medium that I had in my desk, and I wrote what I actually knew, all of it. The gale and the silver eyes and the fold in space, and the assessment, and the ceiling point in Kit's 40 seconds, and what the assessment said about us, about why we were dangerous, about why the model didn't hold, about why a species that could walk through walls and anticipate human behavior across population-wide datasets had nonetheless stood in a storage bay and handed over a gemstone because a 23-year-old thief had pointed a dead man's switch at them and refused to be predictable. I wrote about Lung Yu too, not in terms of his crimes, which were in other files, in terms of what he represented, the irreducible human factor, the person who exists outside the model not because he is exceptional, but because he is exactly human in a specific and inconvenient way, the way that produces individuals whose behavior is governed not by optimal outcomes, but by pride and habit and a particular philosophy about loss. Every population has them. They cannot be modeled out. They cannot be isolated from the dataset because they are the dataset. They are part of what we are, and any assessment of human behavior that doesn't fully account for them is an assessment that will be surprised. I wrote that down. I wrote all of it down. I wrote about the diamond too, about holding it, the weight and the cold of it, the way its light behaved wrongly, about the coordinates inside it that pointed to a decision we had delayed and not erased. I wrote, the ceiling point still exists. The Gale will return to her people with an argument for continued observation. Whether they are persuaded is a question I cannot answer. What I can say is that the delay is real and the standoff is real and the dead man's switch is real. And Kit is the kind of person who builds a tracer over 3 months while also stealing for a living, and she will not stop being that person. The Veth know this now. They know it in a way that was not in their model before tonight. I wrote, the margin of error in their assessment of us just got wider. I wrote, that margin is what we have to work with. That was the document I kept on physical storage. I updated it twice in the months that followed, once when I identified a second shell subsidiary in the Ring 7 corporate registry, and quietly had it shuttered through a bureaucratic mechanism that left no enforcement fingerprints, and once when Kit contacted me through a channel I won't describe to tell me that the Gale had reappeared briefly on a different station, and departed without incident and without taking anything, just observing, which was either a good sign or a different kind of threat, and I spent a week deciding which, and ultimately concluded it was both and moved on. Because that is what you do with a standoff. You move on. You live inside it. You maintain your position and you watch the perimeter and you do your job, which is to keep the throughput moving and know who is watching you while you do it. Because the thing about being an enforcement inspector is that your job is to maintain the record, and the record in this case mattered, not for the collective, Not for Lung Yu, not even for Ko Kit, who would make her own record in her own way over the years that followed. For the humans who came after. For the people who would eventually press outward past the system's edge and encounter whatever it was at the convergence point, and who would need to know that the assessment had already been run, and the conclusion had already been reached, and that the conclusion had been suspended because of a specific human quality that no probability model had yet managed to fully account for. The quality of being exactly what you are even when the math says you should behave differently. The quality of being, as a species, profoundly and stubbornly, and sometimes catastrophically impossible to contain in someone else's model. The quality of sending a thief to steal a gemstone and having her come home instead with a delay in the verdict and a dead man's switch and a negotiating position. The diamond sat in its vault below me and held its coordinates and its encoded message, patient, lit by its own light. I finished my document and saved it to physical storage and locked the desk. Outside the observation port behind my desk, the orbital sun reflector turned in its slow cycle, and the planet turned below, and the station held its position in the slot designated 44 North, and 40,000 people slept their shifts and worked their rotations and moved their cargo and complained about recycled air, and planned their small futures in the way that humans plan small futures, with a great deal of improvised optimism and almost no real information. I thought good. I put on my jacket and went to find coffee, and I didn't look back at the desk, and I didn't reach for the flask. It was enough for that morning. It was enough. The flask stayed in my pocket all the way to the commissary, and I drank the coffee black, and I watched the reflector turn, and I thought about nothing in particular for the first time in a very long while.